Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us to the Open DiscourseNet seminar, London. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all for a wonderful talk by Chris Fitzgerald and Dawn Knight, Navigating Virtual Meetings, Multimodality and Variation in Online Professional Discourse. Before we start, I would like to invite Johannes to say a few words about DiscourseNet. Over to you, Johannes.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Dawn and Chris, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to have you here. DiscourseNet is an international association for discourse studies. We were founded in 2019, and after quite some time together, organizing events, projects, publications in discourse studies as an interdisciplinary and international field. I want to encourage everybody attending our series and seminars to join us. Everything is online on our webpage, DiscourseAnalysis.net, and you can see our events. We have another series of conferences and events in the pipeline now, and we also have other seminars. So we have this regular seminar, and I hope everybody is registered here in Discourse Analysis net for the seminar. And we have a seminar also in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French. And so it's good that we can do this together here, despite the problems with traveling and public health. So it's been a good way to continue with our exchanges and our discussions. So welcome here, and I give the floor to Jaspal.
Well, thanks, Johannes. And I just pass on to Stephanie, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Hi, everyone. Hello again. I'm also very happy to welcome Dawn and Christopher here today. And I'll just like to introduce you all to them in case you don't know them yet. Dawn Knight is a reader at Cardiff University, and we're so glad to have her here. She has published extensively on in books and in academic journals on how to construct and analyze multimodal and multimedia corpora. And what she's probably at the moment more well known for is all the projects that she's been a principal investigator or co-investigator in. I'm just going to mention a few. The list is quite long, and I'm trying to summarize it for you. So one of the bigger ones that she led on was an ESRC-funded creation of a large-scale open-source corpus of contemporary Welsh language. From what I understand, that project has finished, but she's now involved in a few more. One example is she is a co-investigator on the UKRI-funded Coronavirus Discourses project, in which they cooperate with or are in partnership with Public Health England, Wales, and NHS Education for Scotland, in which they analyze the flow and impact of public health messages throughout the pandemic. And more relevant for today is another project that she is a co-principal investigator on, which is the AHRC/IRC funded Interactional Variation Online project on harnessing emerging technologies in the digital humanities to analyze online discourses in different workplace contexts. This is where she cooperates with Christopher Fitzgerald. He's also working on this project. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Mary Immaculate College. Before that, he finished his PhD at the University of Limerick. His thesis was on, or in his thesis, he explored the oral history documents from a linguistic perspective, and he's taught in TESOL and applied linguistics. And they'll give a joint talk today on the project that they're currently collaborating on. So over to you. I'm very excited to listen to this.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for the kind introduction and for the invitation as well. I don't think I've ever been introduced as somebody that's associated with lots of projects, but I guess that's quite nice. Don't know what that says about me, but lovely, thank you. So yeah, we're going to be focusing on one particular piece of work that's ongoing. It started in August last year, but it's still very much kind of in its early days of where we're at in terms of development and stuff. But hopefully from this talk, you'll get an idea of the sorts of things that we're planning to sort of investigate in this work, and you'll get to see where we're at right now. So as Jasper just said there, we're going to pitch this kind of as, so yeah, it's work in progress. Going to keep it moderately informal. So we'd like a lot of feedback from you, some thoughts from you. Hopefully what we're going to talk about will prompt quite a lot of, discussion at the end. As we go through, just drop your questions in there and we'll come back to them later. I'm going to kick us off and then Chris is going to take over, but we might make it interactive as well. And we might even call on Geraldine Mark, who's also on the call. She's another person on the project. So Geraldine, you're not going to get away with this. So this is what we're going to be talking about. As Stephanie has mentioned, you'll see a few logos at the bottom. I'm going to talk through all of this in a bit. Chris, are you in charge of the screen? Yeah. Yes, can you click? There we are. This is the context. We can all relate to this. Pre-pandemic days, this is what meetings looked like, possibly. That was, we all knew how to kind of perform and operate in them, but this is a bit more with what we're doing now, isn't it? This is kind of more familiar to us now. And this is not going to go away. Online meetings, kind of pushed by the pandemic, I guess, something that we've adapted to very quickly. As I say, it's not going to go away, but this is a particular interest to us in terms of unpacking how we do this. What online meetings or online interaction actually looks like. And next slide, please. That's kind of the same sort of thing. So it's accounting for the sort of the workplace interaction. So how these things are performed online, but also how we kind of include these other little bits as well. So when we have any sort of meeting, so if you think about going to maybe a board of studies or something, there's always space for interaction. There's always space for this more interpersonal kind of bit. And what we're going to try and discover in our project is how these things kind of piece together. What makes for useful and kind of effective communication in these sorts of contexts, the sorts of questions that we're asking, basically. I'm going to come back to research questions in a minute, but even just looking at those images and thinking about us kind of performing in those sorts of contexts, these sorts of things come to the floor, I guess. What happens to turn taking when we go online? Who can speak? Who decides who can speak? Even coming into this meeting, there's a certain way we do things, isn't there? We're all sat in the waiting room. We have to be invited in. These are kind of learned behaviors, but it's an interesting sort of dynamic, and we're trying to unpack how these things kind of operationalize. How do meetings open and close? Who's kind of in charge? Who dictates this? And what impact does that have on access, really, on how people can actually engage in the conversation? Who gets to talk, and what impact might that have on equality and things? Because it really changes the dynamics. Our meeting's more transactional now. We talk about this quite a lot within my own sort of peer groups and stuff. Is there space for that more interpersonal stuff, or is it just down to the business of meetings? And what effect does that have? Is it less relational? Quite a few people had jobs in COVID, or they've kind of joined new workplaces in COVID, and maybe they've missed out on a bit of that relational stuff, because everyone's kind of, you get to the point where you hate being online looking at the camera. So maybe what are we missing out on? What things do we kind of forfeit when we try to keep these things a bit more fine-tuned and short and snappy? What about roles, power semantics, gender, ethnicity? How do these variables sort of impact on who speaks and for how long? There's a lot going on. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, sorry. Next
one. So it's this notion of a fractured ecology, really. When we're online, there's a few things that are missing, and this is a really interesting piece of work, and this is something that we've kind of used as an interesting point of departure for what we're looking at. Things like smell and touch are absent. The visual is limited to a kind of quasi two-dimensional perception. So it's it's kind of 3D, but it's also not. It's very fixed. Context is very flat when we're looking at a screen. Auditory is almost unchanged, but we're still when we sit in front of a computer and the way we're sat, we make decisions on how people can eventually perceive the communication and what they get out of it. There's changes in relationship between the distances. So things like proxemics are quite interesting. When we're face to face, that's quite easy to account for and to think about in detail. But what happens when we're interfacing with a computer? And body kind of interactions as well. I don't know if you can hear the trains going past, but hopefully not. Yes, you. Okay, next screen, please. Next slide. So in terms of what we're doing then, just to bring it back, the aims and objectives of the project we're talking about, as I've already started, interactional variation online, harnessing emerging technologies in the digital humanities to analyze online discourse in different workplace contexts. So the key there is different workplace contexts. So taking it out of just the academic sort of context and thinking about different types of workplaces and how that impacts on the kind of interaction that we see. The key research questions are there. What comprises successful and unsuccessful communication online? How does communication, both verbal and non-verbal, manifest in online workplace interaction across these different contexts? And then the third one's quite important here is how can we facilitate more research into this type of data? So if we go on to the next slide, please, Chris. The two sort of key objectives then, I'll go to the second one first because it links to that. Not only are we kind of investigating our own research questions within this project, but we want to enable kind of future researchers and capacity building in this area. And there's an expression I use and my colleagues on the project think it's quite funny, but it's kind of enabling quick and dirty sort of approaches to this thing. It's my previous work that I'm going to kind of talk about in a bit. There's a kind of an assumption that you need a lot of technology to do anything that involves, collecting data, particularly video data, because the whole process from recording to the analysis and annotation and so on can be quite tech heavy. And we want to strip that down a little bit to make it more accessible to more people. So again, that quick and dirty way, how can we enable and scaffold future research and practice? So everything we're producing, it's kind of guidelines for good practice. So we're going to share as much as possible. And that's kind of the part of the ethos of the project is enabling other people to do the same sorts of things. And also, obviously, the other aim at the top there, to enhance our understanding of language use within virtual workplace interactions. Unlike previous projects I've worked on, so for example, the Welsh National Corpus, that was building a big data set. This is slightly different. This is a smaller sort of series of case studies. We don't intend to or envisage that we can answer all the questions. We're just going to kind of make a start. We're going to articulate the main challenges of actually doing this sort of work, capturing this sort of thing and describing it. So again, that's why point 2 is important, because it's just the start. Does that make sense, hopefully? The team, beautiful people, lots of us across different universities, different institutions, and it's very much a UK-Ireland big collaboration. And this is useful in terms of this thing about sharing good practice across different countries. It can be difficult, even just practical things like how we think about data sharing and ethics. And they're the kind of less sexy bits about research, but quite important as well. So thinking through those challenges is something else as well that we intend to kind of disseminate and talk about too. And I should mention, actually, if you go back to that last slide, I'm the co-PI, so there's a joint kind of leaders on this. The other person is Anne O'Keefe. I should just mention her. Next slide, please, Chris. We've also got the other side of the team, our partners, who are the kind of, when we think about benefactors or people that this sort of research, so the first part in terms of understanding sort of effective workplace communication, these are the sorts of benefactors to that, the sort of end users. And you can see there's quite a vast sort of array of different types of workplaces here, from estate agents to university presses to the UNESCO Cities of Literature and a petrol company and Public Health Wales. So all of them are very different domains. So interaction or online interaction to them looks very, very different, which has been really, really helpful, because these will hopefully be data sources as well, so we can understand, and each of them have their own sort of interests in what we're doing and how they might sort of benefit from it, and we're trying to kind of navigate and bring that together. So we can envisage having sort of mini case studies in these different sort of contexts to draw out what we're trying to do. Next slide, please. We've also, the other part of the team, and this is where people on this call might actually come in, We're trying to kind of extend or create a sort of researcher network, something that is, you know, again, trying to draw collaborations across different countries. We're focusing on what we're doing, but trying to extend it to other people as well. Anybody else has any sort of interest in broad areas of corpus linguistics, compilation, multimodal corpus analysis, professional discourse, basically lots of different things. We will plug this at the end as well. Very informal gatherings, and anybody's allowed to come along and present. So we're also going to open the floor to anyone to come along with their own research problems should they want to. Fabulous. So just to bring us back to the actual research, when we're looking at workplace interaction, we all kind of know and intuitively workplace or virtual communication varies significantly from in-person communication. There's lots of different things going on. And it's not just the fact that we're sat on our own looking at a screen. There's other things that kind of impact on what, you know, and how the communication unfolds. Establishing common ground can be more difficult in multi-party conversations for a start, because you're lacking in certain things. You're lacking in that shared space or point of reference, aren't you? When you're sat in a meeting up face to face, even just looking at each other, you can create sort of relationships, and there's certain points of reference which you don't really have. The shared context looks a bit different. So again, defining what context means in sort of this sort of this sort of chat, I can't think of a word there, it'll come back to me later, is part of the aims of the project. Recent work on virtual communication during the pandemic showed that digital tools for workplace communication, they kind of reduce physical barriers to communication and expand social context, but social conversations can often be quite lacking in terms of them being spontaneous. So it's all a bit more measured. It's quite rehearsed and quite kind of learnt, as I said. And we're just trying to unpack this in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. Just to say, one of the approaches we're going to use, just because I have a bit of expertise in this, is a bit of a multimodal corpus sort of approach. And if you don't know, a corpus is basically a principal collection of language data from real life context. The useful thing about looking at online interaction is it's quite easy to record. And even we're going to share good practice about best sort of ways of doing that. Modern corpora vary in size and scope. We're not looking to build something huge, but we're looking again at the sort of more case study approach. But we will be using a principled sampling frame that Chris will be talking about soon. And we need to think about things about at the bottom there in terms of balance, representativeness. Representativeness is particularly important. Does that data set represent what it's supposed to? It's quite a tricky thing to achieve. But arguably when it's about sort of online interaction, because it is so ubiquitous, and because, you know, there is less kind of interference when we're recording online, it's just happening without us. There's no kind of visible extra things in the room to interfere with the interaction. Maybe it's a bit easier to get this sort of data. Next one, please. Just to say, in terms of this sort of area, I did a lot of research. I feel old when I talk about this. Back when I did my PhD on multimodal corpus linguistics, and it hasn't really developed that much since then. Again, because it used to be very tech heavy, and it used to require a lot of expertise and a lot of digital resources. But things have changed a bit. But the most notable sort of advances in the field have been in sort of sign language research, multimodal discourse analysis, and some work that kind of drew on systemic functional theory as well. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and we're trying to bring all this together as well in what we create in terms of guidelines of good practice and how you might kind of adapt what we're doing to your own sort of context. But yeah, multimodal corpus linguistics is still quite new. And I can tell you why in a minute when we go to the next slide, maybe. Yes. So the key difference between multimodal corpus linguistics and more kind of multimodal discourse analysis is text, I guess. So the traditional text-based corpus inquiry, multimodal corpus analysis includes not only detailed qualitative analysis, but quantitative stuff as well. So we're looking at emerging patterns of language in use. They kind of have the affordances to enable more empirical analysis at a kind of macro level. It's about having kind of more instances, more data for us to kind of drill down into, and characterizing patterns based at, you know, at quantity really. So the data sets tend to be more extensive. Next slide, please. So just in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about multimodal corpora, it tends to, there's two different kind of definitions. Some of them are static and it can be based on pictures. We're looking more at the latter of these, the second of these, where we're looking at time series data. So anything that involves sort of video and audio as well. And as soon as we get those types of data, we have different challenges. So as traditional sort of corpus linguists, we know how to look at spoken data, but what we tend to do is represent that as text. So there's always that sort of processing thing, and as soon as we start representing something as text, we're already annotating it, we're already analyzing it in a way because we're interpreting what we see. What do we do then when we've got video and we've got audio and we've got other things going on? That's where the key challenges lie, and that they've been there for quite a while. We're still not that good at capturing kind of what we see in an effective way. Next slide, please. Okay, there are some current multimodal corpora. This is just in case you want to go and have a look. The AMI meeting corpus is, for us, very convenient actually, because extensive, I think over 100 hours of meeting room interactions, but it's a normal meeting room, so it's face to face. That will give us a really useful sort of kind of point for comparison actually when we're looking at the virtual meeting rooms. Some others there as well. It's always good to plug your own data, isn't it? Terrible, shameful. And yeah, quite a few things going on. I said some of the challenges, and these are, if you're sat there thinking, yeah, analyzing video, what are the sorts of basics that we need to think about? And it's this line at the top, which is, I guess it's something that we face when we're looking at any sort of corpora anyway. How are we going to capture it? How are we going to kind of transcribe it, code it, present it, and represent it, and analyze it? And also this second point, naturalistic data versus reusable recordings. This has been a really big challenge in sort of traditional multimodal corpus linguistics because, you know, you don't just, you know, there's no sort of situation where you just happen to have a video camera recording people doing things. It has to be quite prescribed. You have to, it's more kind of lab-based traditionally because you obviously need permission. You need somewhere people to sit down together for you to record in order to make it reusable. So you need to be able to replay it and have a look at it and annotate it and so on. So that's quite tricky, trying to balance those two things. Arguably, when it's virtual meeting rooms, again, maybe that's a little bit easier. You still need permission, so don't go away and start recording things and analyzing them, but it's changed the dynamics of that. It makes it a little bit easier. But once we have recorded it, you see an example of transcription there. What do we do with the data? How do we make it, how do we put it into a point or into something that can be analyzed? Next slide, please. Just to show you, this is really old stuff. We did some early investigations in multimodal corpus linguistics. Is it gonna work?
Yeah.
Yay. Trying to test how we could build sort of gesture trackers. So this is a gesture tracker, and you can see there's a blue screen. It's quite artificial really, and these are based on color, and what this is trying to do is just to capture when the person is nodding their head. We thought, hey, yeah, brilliant, let's see if we can to build something that's automatically going to tell us when certain things happen. Because imagine if you've got video of somebody talking to you, what, you know, if you're going to unpack the sort of non-verbal parts of communication, where do you start? There's many different things we can look at. And we were trying to build sort of tools to do this automatically. Didn't work very well. And again, this is the end of the extreme where it's high tech, lots of resources needed. This isn't what we're going to do, but it just shows that you know, thought it through a little bit, and we've got a bit of expertise in this. Next one, please. There's another example here, actually. There's other things that we have. So pre-existing research in psychology and gesture studies here. We know how we can code certain movements. So this is trying to look at certain hand movements, and we can map, you know, it gives us really sophisticated ways of mapping things. We're thinking now, how can we do this in a slightly more quick and dirty way that's meaningful? And in multi-party talk as well, even more challenging. If I tried to do it now, if everybody had the videos on, we've recorded just this 1 hour. Imagine how much data we get. Making sense of that, annotating it, capturing it is going to be tricky. Again, this is plugging a tool that no longer works, but this is an early example of us trying to bring these things together. So the next challenge would be, how do we make sense of what we've got? So this was a tool called the Digital Replay System that we built when I was in Nottingham. It's got this PhD supervision here on the top left, the transcription of that, and it's because it's time series, they're aligned together. And at the bottom is a concordancer. So if you're a corpus linguist, the first thing we want to look for is kind of frequency of certain things. Chris, I might play this actually. It's fun. It doesn't exist anymore, but can we play that?
Yeah.
You can see here that it's going to scroll down and find when we're looking at head nods. So yeah, there's all the words that occur there. We know how to do this. We know how to analyze that sort of data. It's going to search for a word. Yeah. Come on. There we go. And there we go. And there's all the transcript, the instances of yeah. And as you scroll down, you could jump to the time. This might be quite loud. Hopefully not. Oh no, you can see it on the transcript. And we could also there look for certain codes in the data. So here it's looking for a type of head nod, and it's going to be a small nod of a short duration. And if you scroll down there, we can see examples where they co-occur. So it's looking for patterns of the kind of spoken and non-verbal behavior as well. So that would jump to it.
Yeah, review. Yeah, and identify.
Unfortunately, the video didn't work very well, but he does nod his head. Okay, and it just that was the sort of early ways of us investigating this. Problem was money ran out, wasn't sustained. So great tool, but no longer exists. Again, this is an example of the other end of the scale, not quick and dirty. But there are certain things, there's certain technologies, and there's certain kind of thoughts, there's certain sort of processes that we thought through, other people have thought through till now that we can learn from. And that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to see what understand the complete sort of landscape of this sort of research before we provide something that is an alternative way of doing things. Next slide, please, Chris. Just to say, so that tool, you might think, oh, well, I know of better tools than that for displaying and annotating non-verbal behaviors or time series data. Well, some of the obvious ones are Elan and Anvil. And in fact, we, with our sort of top tips guides and things, Elan would be the one to use probably because it's nice and free. So the next slide will show you Elan. Here it is. Yeah. So again, it looks kind of similar, but again, all time series data. But the point of this thing, the point of this is kind of take away from this. So you can see the video, again, the transcript, there's the audio output, and then there's annotations there of certain things. So that could be maybe certain things, you might have meaning-based things or functional things that you want to mark up, or gestures, or but it ends up being very complex as a data set. So the next question would be, how do you kind of approach that? Where are the moments of the important instance that are happening there? What things are critical for us to unpack? And again, that is what we're seeking to kind of discover in this project. What's on the next slide? And this is my last slide. I'm going to pass over to Chris in a minute, I think. So when we're thinking of annotation, we think about level of detail. We're thinking about creating a sort of standard framework for doing this. Even when I say the quick and dirty thing, I'm going to keep saying that. I know it's awful. But even basic guidelines on how do you annotate certain types of head nod? How do you annotate gaze direction? There are millions of different frameworks out there, but we're trying to think of how we can consolidate this and make it meaningful for applied linguists to use. Technical issues, how do you overcome them? How do we make it as simple but effective and replicable as possible? And capturing data, what does it look like? Yeah, there's loads of things going on here, and I'm going to pass on to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Yeah, loads of things going on, and I'm going to go a little bit more detail into some of those and different strands of our data now. We're not just looking at the video data, though I'll look at that in a bit more detail, but some other aspects of data too that we think are relevant before really launching into the analysis of that. So the next steps and our progress to date.
As Dawn said, she showed those lovely pictures of all of the staff earlier. Big effort into staff recruitment, including myself and Geraldine Mark, who is in the call there too, Geraldine, and building the team. I just started at the start of January. Geraldine has been in the project a little bit longer. And yeah, so building the team, we really, I think, well set up now, Dawn, I think, and collaborating very well and making a lot of progress together. And Dawn also mentioned all of those partners earlier, the other stakeholders who are involved in this project, and reaching out to those and trying to get data from these partners as well, is something that we're still engaged in. Dawn mentioned ethical clearance, and this is quite complex, especially when it's inter-institutional, and I know was a lengthy process that Dawn and Dan were engaged in for not a huge amount of time, but I think a lot of effort in a condensed amount of time. And evaluating the state of the art, so looking at all, like what Dawn has been mentioning there, all of the literature and all the previous studies that are leading up to this. And these last 2 points are what I'll be expanding on here. So surveying the baseline of behaviors, and we did that via a survey, which I'll give you some details of now. And then also, like Dawn mentioned, designing the sample frame and gathering some pilot data. We'll give you some examples of that now too. So surveying the baseline, like I said, we put out a survey to anybody who would really take the survey up to a certain point, and it's still open. We have over 300 respondents at the moment, and a good balance of genders there, and age spectrum is quite representative too. So we started off by, I guess, like a lot of people, sending the survey out to our close circle, and for us that meant a lot of academics and people in education, but then we got a little bit more strategic and sent the survey out mostly via LinkedIn and kind of cold calling almost people through LinkedIn, and then gathering some respondents from various industries like you can see here, and also various job titles and people at different levels in their careers. And also something that's quite important and interesting for us is getting a spectrum of people, the amount of time that people are in their roles. So people who have started their jobs during COVID or during the kind of pivot to this environment. So we have a lot of people who did start their positions during COVID too. So what are their perspectives versus people who went from face-to-face to online, maybe back to face-to-face now. So let's look at some results then. One question which was of interest to us was understanding people's use of the various platforms. Like Dawn said, we're interested in putting out some information about data capturing. So how do we capture data from these different platforms? And it was interesting for us to see that the more professional or the more formal meetings, like team meetings or institutional meetings, happen mostly, I mean, overall, a lot of Zoom and a lot of Teams, but the more formal situations tend to be through Teams. And then there's a bit of a flip of that with the more social occasions. Social occasions there means things like the kind of work social occasions. So, the online coffees, or then things organized by the institution or just organized by colleagues.
Chris, can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, there was one of our partners, fascinating conversation with them. They said that it was a conscious decision, this actually. So on a Friday, they would switch to Zoom because they had space to interact and space to actually have more kind of social interactions with each other, because Teams had a very different sort of identity. To them, it was very much institutional talks. They knew that when they went onto Teams, you had to perform in a certain way, which was kind of a fascinating thing. But from those talks with the partners, they've been really, really rich in terms of the sorts of background sort of data that we've got. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, no bother. And that definitely supports what I've been finding too, because I've been putting together a document to share about data capturing and looking into the various platforms. And I'm glad that we're on Zoom now, because I'm going to criticize Teams a bit. Teams, to me anyway, it tries to do a bit too much. Like it's Microsoft trying to plug all of its different features into one platform. And then that kind of, I think it stifles the actual video, the flexibility of having virtual meetings. Whereas Zoom, I think there's a lot more flexibility for data capturing, a lot more easier ways to capture the chats that happen, and just overall flexibility and ease of use. And maybe that's why it's a little bit more popular for social types of events as well. But other questions then that we're asking through this survey, and a little bit more qualitative here. So asking both what works well in the online environment and what doesn't work well. And maybe this will be quite relatable to a lot of you here. So what doesn't work well, first of all? What does work well? People saying that they can Google answers to questions during the seminar. So a bit of the background activity, and all of these extra activities helping people to stay focused, which is quite surprising. And also, as we'll see in the next slide, that's a negative. People feel like they can't stay focused. Some people feel like that through this environment too. But also the convenience, and it's the technical aspects that come out quite a lot in people's positive perceptions of this environment. So like sessions being recorded most of the time, one doesn't need to travel anywhere. The chat box option gives people a place to respond or ask questions like we have here. No questions in yet, no? And reaching the whole team regardless of location. So again, accessibility and ease of use and convenience. So convenience being one of the ubiquitous themes in the positives, but then the negatives happen to be a little bit more affective. And I guess what a lot of people might relate to as well here, and we've been mentioning it already, is the lack of ability to really socially engage with other people through informal interactions. And then that reducing the ability to brainstorm, that, as you can see a point down there, the ability to exchange of ideas, just meeting people, building team spirit, picking up the mood music of a room. If we were presenting this face to face, we might get a little bit more of a sense of how people are reacting to this and engaging in it. Anybody who's been teaching over the last year or two will probably relate to that too. And with no face-to-face, the presenter cannot see facial expressions. So you can see some facial expressions now, but not all. And so, again, that coming back to feeding back into the presenter as well and engagement. People find it hard to keep concentrated. And then the technical aspects here, like slow internet, can lead to confusion if sound is continually cutting out. So these are just some of the responses that we found interesting through our survey. But we're also looking at social media. Social media is a nice way of gauging public sentiment towards various things, even though as any Twitter users will know, it can be quite polar and can be quite direct. But it does give you some sense of public opinion towards different aspects of whatever's happening at a certain time. So we started to create a corpus and look into how people were responding to working from home on Twitter. And we can see, as all social media tends to be now, not just text-based either, but using a lot of images, a lot of GIFs, a lot of videos, a lot of emojis. So the kind of linguistic landscaping going on here too, people taking pictures of their work setting, if it's outside, or the kind of snacks and nice things about working from home. But like I said, it can be quite polar, and we know that this comes across here too, because some people are saying that they hate working from home, others people are saying it's the best thing ever. And then themes that come out quite a lot are people's pets and just the ability to be able to go outside, convenience, but also, coming across through our social media analysis as well, the kind of reasons why people don't like working from home. Some people find it hard if they have young kids at home. Other people who are alone, living alone, seem to find it quite hard to stay working from home. And, I tried to get this sample while people were returning to the office, and people who were dying to return to the office, but then people who were very reluctant to as well. So then coming back to our core data, really, so our gathering of these virtual meetings. And as Dawn said, it's really important to have a structured sampling frame to start with. So that helps us to understand that whatever we are sampling is representative of the overall population. And that's, it's standard across lots of different research fields, not just linguistic research, but comes from the hard sciences as well, representativeness being a cornerstone of that. So when we talk about a sampling frame, this is also known as a design frame, and it's a rubric that defines which texts from which genres and in what proportions are to be sampled for use in a corpus. We're breaking this down over the next couple of slides. So sampling frames are also enable users to assess both how suitable a data set or corpus is for undertaking a given line of inquiry, and then also how comparability is really important. Dawn mentioned other corpora that we might be using as reference corpora for this. And Dawn might actually come back in here for the next two slides, because this is her work and I don't want to misrepresent it. That's okay, Dawn?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, just to say, so we're not kind of envisaging building a massive corpus, but we're still taking the sort of principles of kind of effective corpus design on board when we're doing this. Some just generic questions, these are just for reference, I guess. And we think about the approaches used to underpin the development of the design frame, sort of context types or genres of text that we might want to draw on, what resources or information do we want to kind of reference in order to kind of set up targets for data collection. What is a text? What does it look like? How long should it be? This is an interesting one when it comes to the online kind of meeting context. one of our partners, we said to them when we explained we obviously explained the project and talked them through what we would like. They made a recording, but only of the middle part of the talk. So that was the business part. So they completely got rid of the stuff that we're interested in. So the more interactional things. So even communicating what constitutes a text and what sort of thing we're interested in looking at. Obviously, it seems quite obvious, but these things really need to be thought through in quite a lot of detail before we kind of go out and start to collect things. So that's why we're still at the piloting phase and still trying to articulate this. And we're thinking about taxonomies as well, how we kind of categorize things. Again, there's a lot going on. What does a text look like and this sort of thing? And some of the common sort of taxonomy labels that we have in corpus design are these. So we think about mode, context, topic, genre, who, as in the participants, where they are, who are they talking to, that target audience, but it also might be the sorts of ages and sort of relationships as well. Obviously, these aren't directly relatable to what we're doing, but they are, again, a good, useful point of departure. And to say, you know, this is why it's still quite early on, because there's a lot of things to be thinking about for this. And back to Chris, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so as Tom was saying, a lot of these are relevant, but a lot of these need to be adapted, or we might have new areas to look at here too. So what we're really looking at is trying to get a spectrum of meeting types. So within business meetings, looking at whole organizations across department, team meetings, one-to-one meetings, seminars, I guess you could call this a seminar, training meetings, and then the social meetings as well that might pick up on a lot of that social interaction. So we want to get, I guess, built into that as well is the number of participants. Is there a kind of inherent understanding of the number of participants of these? The range of roles as well. So I mentioned some of the roles from our questionnaire. We'd like to get a lot of those involved in our data as well, and having kind of hierarchies within our data sets. And so if the meetings are being conducted just internally, or the internal to external, the stage of meeting, like Don said, it can be difficult sometimes because it's hard, I guess, because with a lot of these, there's often the moment where people say, I'm going to start recording now. And that's usually after the kind of social interaction. And then so it can be quite hard to get those preambles. So we want to get all stages of meetings if possible. And then the content. So we want a range of meeting topics within our data. So this would be great if we can get all of this. This would be kind of a selective approach, you know, if we end up having kind of an abundance of data and the opportunities to gather an abundance of data that takes all of this into account. But we might also be leaning on a kind of opportunistic approach that might end up just being looking at what we can get.
Can I interrupt there again?
Yes.
Sorry. You'll note that these are text external characteristics, and that's on purpose. We started off thinking about this and conceptualizing it as we realized it was all text internal. So the sort of functions of meetings and the sort of purposes, which are really fascinating, but they will have to come after the fact, because once you're in a meeting in that situation, sometimes it's very difficult to define. And it's actually the language that's going to guide us in terms of those sorts of definitions. So these are easy in terms of very broad categories, but very kind of text external. So that's why they look a bit, that's why they're kind of formulated like that. But that just makes it easy to group in certain ways. I just thought I said that. And in terms of the opportunistic thing, it's kind of okay to have opportunistic sort of corpora. We've seen the spoken BNC 2014, 10 million words, well, nearly all of that's opportunistic. Sometimes we have to rely on that because it can be quite tricky to get data if it's too principled, too selective. Chris.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time now too. We've gone past the Q2 mark. So I'll just skip through a few examples now too. We've already mentioned what it means, what multimodal analysis means really. So incorporating not just the verbal, but non-verbal communication, including hand gestures, facial expressions, things like gaze, prosodic features as well. So things like stress and intonation and rhythm, and text. And text in this case to us means the kind of side chat, the things that might be happening in the chat. So we also want to incorporate all of these modes. And this means, you know, examples of things like we'll see on this slide. So hand gestures. So this is taken from our pilot data. So hand gestures, which of course we're familiar with, but might have different meanings or be used in slightly different ways, and maybe even have an expanded repertoire in this setting. So, you know, things like the fingers being crossed, a lot of gestures being used because people don't want to verbally interrupt the speaker as well. You know, the hand being put up or finger being put up to take the floor. things that don't really happen in face-to-face meetings. And then this leads to us having to consider how we're going to annotate these, and Dawn was mentioning this, but moving beyond kind of traditional or standard frameworks of this type of annotation that might be based around face-to-face interactions. Again, if we're expanding our repertoire and if these gestures have different meanings in these settings, then we need to have a new kind of framework for annotating these and describing these. So that was hand gestures. Also, gaze is something that we're very interested in, because gaze is something in this environment that can be quite tricky to categorize. What happens to eye contact? Are people looking at the same person here? We have one person who's looking up because he's thinking of a person's name. He's trying to think of a person's name. Don't ask about the helmet. We have, so are people making eye contact? If I look at my camera, am I making eye contact with you, but I'm not looking at you anymore? So this is something that we have to consider as well with data capturing and understanding exactly where people are looking when to look at each other within the setting. And different ways of categorizing gaze in this study. So this was also with a camera involved, so not exactly natural either. And if we go back to what Dawn was showing earlier with the laboratory setting, that's not exactly natural because of the imposition of the technology. Here, we can look at somebody making eye contact with their interlocutor, having gaze direction going up, gaze direction going down, gaze direction going sideways. But what does that mean in this setting? If I look sideways here, I'm looking off into my bedroom. So that obviously the context plays a strong part in that here too. Okay, so head movement. I have just a couple of videos here. Jaspal, if we're doing okay for time, these are very short videos just to show, this is a very short clip that shows two people. I'd like you to look at the two people at the bottom of this and, their head movements that are co-occurring here.
I think that is not doable within the timescale given other commitments. What do you reckon?
Okay, so you can see just in that very short clip, a lot of movement happening, and that would mean a lot of annotation to do too. And, two seemingly conflicting head movements, one person who's shaking his head and one person who's nodding. That's because they're agreeing with a negative statement. So, a lot going on just with these 5 panels. So let's move on then to the construction of kind of turn taking and what happens in this context too. This is especially important for business meetings when you have a chair who's trying to keep the meeting coherent. Of course, that would happen in face-to-face meetings too, but it gets a little bit more complex, we think, in these types of settings, because overlapping dialogue can be a little bit difficult to deal with. You can have people dropping out, you can have communication breakdowns. And we see a little bit of management of that by the chair in this instance. And the chair is the person who's in the center top of the screen here.
Yeah.
Cool. Lovely.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying.
I'm not sure if you caught that fully, but it's the type of awkwardness that a lot of people, I think, are familiar with in these settings. How interruptions work, how we manage these interruptions. And this is something that we want to feed back to the stakeholders too. This is one of their incentives to get involved in this process, would be so that they can get some kind of instruction or some kind of feedback as to how better achieve or better make coherent meetings. Okay, so finally then, just some final considerations, and I'll blast through these. So we have a need for conventions to aid our interpretation. We need to think about how can we navigate and query multiple data sets in a meaningful way, and which data source is privileged and provided the way into the data, and how do we categorize that? Is it something that we're looking at as being the most kind of typical data? And then leading from that, then which multimodal resources with multimodal resources, is this always via specific lexical units or clusters or language, or are we looking at those other modes for this? Are we looking at the body language as a way into this? What impact does our approach have on the results gained then as well? So that's something that we'll be probably reflecting on a little bit later. Okay, next steps, we're going to analyze our survey in a little bit more detail. We're going to have follow-up interviews, following up on both the questionnaire and on our video data as well. Producing initial deliverables for the website, which I'll be putting up here in a second again. Dawn already mentioned the researcher network. We'd like for people here who might be interested in a little bit more information about this project and the different strands to this project to maybe engage with that. And you can also access that via the website, which I'll show you on the last slide. There's a tab in there called Researcher Network. We'll be holding our next meeting on the 25th of March. We had the first meeting last week. And we're going to get into a detailed analysis of our sample data from our stakeholders, so breaking it down to the different phases of the meeting and exploring that in more detail through ELAN. And yeah, we're fairly advanced then with exploring tools and a frame of analysis, because as Dawn said, we're kind of settling on ELAN as a tool because of flexibility, convenience, and also familiarity, I guess, is a big part of that too. And then outputs like training materials. Okay, so here is the website. Thank you very much from both of us. If you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. Jaspal, you're on mute, I think. Will I stop?
His mouse is not working?
Okay.
Yes, he can. Well, that was a great example for nonverbal communication. Okay, Jaspal, did you want to, should I just try and manage the Q&A? Yes. Oh. Okay, well, I myself have a few questions, but to be polite, does anyone else want to go first? If you want